Hi, everyone. So today we're going to focus on talking about a specific form of qualitative research that can be labeled or defined as community engaged research. You also hear the term participatory research. And in a future slide, I'm going to show that there's many different names this type of method falls under. So what we're going to do is we're going to take specifically about this form of research and how it relates and is reviewed by an ethics committee, specifically the Institutional Review Board, which focuses on human subject research. And a big element of this that will be talked about is how complex this type of research is. And this type of research may not follow similar human subject models that a lot of IRBs are based upon. And so, really, what we're hoping to take away from today is the importance of flexibility in navigating and understanding that there may not be a one-size-fits-all approach with this type of research, and having some understanding for IRB members how this type of research is conducted could be helpful in the review process. So, what we'll focus on today is defining participatory research and community engaged research. Also, we're going to identify key aspects of PR and CENR relevant to IRBs, and then we'll provide suggestions and ways in which we can review this type of research. More specifically, things to take away is really understand the flexibility for the consent process, have some questions related to data management and other authorship considerations that may be unique to community engaged research. So, what I want to start off with, too, hopefully, what you get away from this lecture is the key takeaways for an institutional review board is to have some sort of flexibility in navigating these approaches because each kind of community engaged research project may have unique elements of it, and the nature of this research requires flexibility. So, with that, what can also be helpful too is this type of research is different than your typical quantitative or laboratory-based human subject research, and it can be helpful from my experience for IRB members to have an understanding of qualitative research because the foundation of community engaged research for the most part is in a qualitative nature. So we want to have some understanding of qualitative research for our community members and our IRB members, and as well as having current or being aware of how our current policies may hinder or support this type of research. And finally, approving this type of research may require some flexibility on the IRB end for policy and procedures and specifically training requirements. And that's going to be a key component with today's presentation is many times we have a pretty much a boilerplate requirement for training. And what that means is many times when someone is submitting a protocol to the IRB, we require some sort of human subject research protection training. Many institutions use the CITI models. There's other versions out there, but typically it is a training that's already exists. Maybe it's accessed online and it's pretty boilerplate. This type of research, especially when we're engaging with the idea that community members may be an active part of the research, that type of training may not be relevant. So therefore, we may need some flexibility and alternative training requirements for this specific type of research. So, before I set the scene, the big hallmark of community engaged research is that we're going to have community members actively involved in the research process. That can be including recruitment of other participants, collecting data, as well as being a participant in the data collection, playing a role in analysis, as well as maybe playing an active role in the dissemination process as well. So here's a little case study that I created to hopefully give you an idea of what a community engaged research protocol may look like. So imagine you're an IRB administrator or a manager and you receive this type of protocol, or likewise, you're an IRB member and you've been asked to review this type of protocol. This is a good encapsulation of what a participatory slash community engaged research protocol may look like. So Here's the protocol. In response to the proposed construction of a new data center, a local farming collective, in partnership with a researcher at your institution, has submitted a protocol to the IRB for a community engaged research project to document potential impact the data center will have on the local farming community. Utilizing a photo voice, a narrative inquiry methodology, participating farmers plan to capture a lived experience data set through photography of farmers' day-to-day activities, audio logs during the day-to-day activities, daily journaling slash memoing, and semi-structured interviews focusing on the locals' perspectives on the proposed data center. The protocol makes it clear that the farmers are not just participants, but co-researchers who will play a lead with the assistance of the PI in data collection, analysis, and the recruitment of local community members. The protocol states that results will be shared with the community and with local and state policy makers. So, to give it a nutshell with this, we have community members who are going to play an active role in data collection, where they're going to be using common qualitative research methods such as narrative, photo voice, narrative inquiry methods that could be journaling, memoing. They're going to also have audio logs and really reflecting on their day-to-day experiences, as well as conducting semi-structured interviews with other local participants to gather perspectives on the data center. In addition, what the goal of this research is to gather this information and then share the results with not just the community, but local and state policymakers related to this potential new data center. So the hallmark of this is what's very clear. Our participants are also playing an active role in the data process, the research process, whether that's data collection, analysis, dissemination, and possibly even design of the research as well. So that's what makes community engaged research rather unique, is that our participants may be playing a more active role or a dual role or a co-research role than a more typical um, human subject protocol where the participants are rather passive in the overall research elements. So what's also helpful to remember is I'm using this word community engaged research or participatory research. It has many various names. We have action research, which is one of the more older names to this. Again, the idea that we are uh, focusing on gathering information and then having individuals maybe part of that process to have some sort of direct action related to that research. We can also have what we call community-led research, which again focuses on this idea that it's the community members who are motivated to collect or engage in research with a particular mission or goal in mind. You'll also see too, but probably a more rare component is a collaborative autoethnography is a way as well where you may have community members who are actively engaging in research, focusing on how their own lived experiences have been shaped by more social and cultural elements. So, no matter what term we use, here are some essence of community engaged research. It actively involves participants in some element of the research life cycle. It could be all these elements, it may just be one or the other, but again, participants are playing an active role in design, data collection, analysis, dissemination. Could even be with recruitment, etc. But there is an active involvement from participants for research activities. Because of this heavily focused on community involvement, this type of research is very relationship driven, meaning PIs or research team members building relationships and vice versa with community members. And what's very important and where ethics comes involved in this requires significant time investment to establish trust between the academic side of this research and the community side of the research. So that's a very important thing to remember especially from an IRB reviewing perspective, that the when community engaged research is occurring, or let's say an academic member is proposing this type of research, the relationships should be the center of this, and it may require relationship work or building that trust may be a major prerequisite before even research protocols are submitted to the IRB. So, in other words, and I see this a few times with student projects, where students have this idea of like they want to work with a specific community, but may not have a prior existing relationship with that community. Well, it may not be relevant or even feasible for a student to submit a semester-long research project where it may take multiple years to establish trust with that community for them to be comfortable enough to even participate, let alone be an active member of the research process. So relationship driven is very, very important. In addition to, I also want to take a moment that to encourage IRB members that to remember many type of researchers who have dedicated their career to community engaged research have the best intentions and have the training and knowledge and respect where they want to really utilize these methods and understand the importance of the relationship. So we want to, for sure, as IRB members, assess that relationship driven component and also give space for the PI and other academic members to share their experience of how they have built this relationship and their own ethics and perspective of this relationship driven component. Relatedly to that, because it's so relationship driven, is early on in the IRB process, even in possibly protocol submission, we may already have community members who are involved in that process. And that's very important for an IRB to reflect upon is how accessible is our IRB process, especially for protocol submission for individuals who may not be affiliated with our institution or other academic institutions. So, for example, think about your own IRB process. Are you still a pen and paper submission form component, or are you electronic submission? And think about how would that process work for a non-affiliated individual in the community to access and be on your protocol. Can they be added to your system? Do they have the means to have access to this system? Are they going to have to require a university email, etc.? So that's something to really consider is if we are really motivated to support and review this type of research, are there any IRB barriers that are in play for community members to engage in this research? And if so, are those barriers going to have some sort of impact on the relationship? Another component is to direct benefit. If community members are motivated to engage in this type of research, typically that motivation is they believe there is going to be some sort of benefit for the community to engage in this research. This is important when we talk about the interpretation of the data as well as sharing the results or dissemination of the data. What is the process that the community members are going to have on the say of this data? What I really support too, and I've heard other researchers who engage in this type of research have talked about, that they're very aware that they may be engaging in a certain type of method and collecting data, and their results, there's a lot of discussion, I should say, that what happens when results from a social science study contradicts a community perspective or community value. And this is a difficult thing to navigate sometimes, but having that awareness and discussion of, all right, if we are focused on building this relationship and working with these community members, researchers, especially on the academic side, should be aware of what is the process going to be if we collect information and we analyze data that in effect may cause more harm to the community than good. What do we submit that data? Do we not submit that data, right? We don't want to also engage in data fabrication or fabrication But what is the community agreement we're going to have with this type of research? How best do we still protect the community, even if we engaging in the research process that may have information that may in fact harm the community? So these are big ethical questions. And again, the more broad component of it, but really just this type of research really requires a lot of reflection and flexibility. Finally, too, we talked about shared resources. Community members and community partners are engaging and working with academic research institutions for a resource component. It could be specific expertise of this type of research. It could be specific equipment. It could be resources like funding grants, etc. So again, there's a shared resource component. And sometimes we need to be aware, even from an IRB level, is what is that shared access going to look like within our community setting? Do we need to get our sponsored programs involved in helping us determine possible risks as well as logistics for it? That may not be a requirement for every proposal, but we also just may need to be aware of, okay, if shared resources are a component of this element, is this something we need to also just have further discussion as well? So, what is something I want you to take away? The research trajectory of, or the research process of community engaged research is very different than what we may be used to in your traditional IRB protocol. So again, remember that a lot of our IRB processes are based off biomedical and behavioral research, typically research that is done in a controlled setting. And that's why too, but when we think about it, our proposals are from soup to nuts. In other words, from start to finish. We have PIs and research uh, key personnel submit protocols that are describing their research process from design all the way to dissemination. And then typically this type of perspective views research in a very linear process. Now, again, that is how we talk about research. If you look at even publications and presentations of research, it's very linear. We started here, we ended there, right? Now, the real world is it's not as linear as we hope. But compare that to community engaged research, where it is not viewed from a linear perspective. It is rather reiterative or iterative. And what I mean by that, this is in nature of the component. Because of that community engaged research element, researchers work with the community, get feedback from the community, and then readjust the project based off that feedback. So it is a much more even mental model of this type of research is a way more squiggly component with a lot of starts, restarts, reflections, modifications. That is the nature of this type of research. Therefore, that type of component doesn't fit our very standard linear element. And that is what's very important for an IRB to remember. The nature of this project needs and requires flexibility. And therefore, as I'll talk about a little bit, we may need to adjust our IRB policies to reflect that squiggly type of research process. And it's important to remember too, and I see this sometimes with IRB members, this squiggly process does not reflect as a disorganized, or it's easy for someone who is very familiar with the traditional linear process of research, see this type of research as chaotic, disorganized, and reflecting that these researchers don't know what they're doing. I want to counter that narrative that inherently the nature of this type of research is squiggly. And so engaging in high quality, community engaged research results in a squiggly projection. That is the process. So therefore, high quality research, unfortunately, from community engaged research is squiggly. That's the nature of it. We then need to modify our policies to help best support that type of squiggly process. So with that, Again, this is why I want to do a lot of education to IRBs about the nature of qualitative research, because it's unfair, I think, for IRB members who are, many of them come from a strong understanding of a more traditional quantitative research component, and then they'll look at a qualitative research project, and it is another world. Okay, so we really need to understand the foundations of qualitative methods. And what's also very important too, and I see this a lot from uh, researchers who have the best intention, that this could be student or early career or researchers who are coming up close to a promotion deadline, that there's unfortunately still this narrative that qualitative research, because it doesn't require statistical analysis, is that it is easier to do, that it's simpler to do, because you don't have to do quote unquote math. For anyone who is engaged in qualitative research, this type of research is very complex, and typically, there's always exceptions to this, qualitative research probably takes more time to conduct than compared to a standard statistical data collection. So, for example, in quantitative, if we're going to use surveys and send 1,000 surveys out to people, compared to if I'm going to interview 20 people, where each interview is 20 hours, and then plus I'm going to transcribe that uh, interview 20 times, as well as then a massive reiterative process of analyzing and rereading and discussing those transcripts. Time-wise, qualitative research is a huge time investment and requires a lot of skill to do it. So I share that because, again, unfortunately, you see, you may have a student who has the best intentions, wants to do a qualitative research project in 3 weeks. Okay. That may not be feasible. So that's an important component, is to really understand that a lot of time and investment and skill is required to do this. Qualitative research um, is on the surface seems simplistic over just interviewing people, but there is more complexity and more academic and research rigor that is required. So I share that to give an idea that really emphasizing we need to really understand these type of methods in order to give a thorough review for it. So that's why I'm going to take a moment to kind of share the essence of our quantitative versus qualitative type research. So again, quantitative, the nature of it is this very similar linear progression where the goal is we're going to gather a lot of data, and typically that data may be very complex. And then using statistical means, we clean and simplify, for lack of a better term, that data into more understandable components. Quantitative is very focused on things we can observe, measure, facts. That's very important. And with that too, there's a strong focus on rigor of our methods. And there are plenty of quantitative research designs out there and statistical analysis components and standard protocols for that. And so, what can be very helpful too is you develop um, a manual or a protocol to how to do this research. And because we know from a quantitative perspective, replicability is very important in being able to replicate that type of research. So I could take one method of quantitative research and apply it into different populations and settings, and that can help with my validity, my rigor, etc. So in other words, that there is more of a clear, precise component for quantitative. Qualitative is a different perspective. So the goal of qualitative research when you're gathering data is you want to gather data that allows you to provide a thick description of whatever you're studying. So we may, with that, to gather that thick description may require a large amount of materials interviews, processes, whatever it may be. We need enough information to really describe the situation. And in addition to that, we are going to be describing that situation through stories and symbols. So we gather those stories through interviews. We may gather those things through symbols, through observation, or participating in certain rituals related to those symbols, again, to share that thick description. The thing that I think can be hard sometimes for someone learning qualitative research is it's very important that whatever your method to understand that situation you want to thickly describe is your method should connect to the context. And with that, every context we know can be unique. Therefore, we may need to have unique methods related to that context. So the method has to fit the case of study. And therefore, it's common to have extreme customizability of the type of method you're using, and you make it your own. So we can have protocols in approaches like photo voice or narrative inquiry or archival research. But depending on what I'm studying, I may use different elements of those to gather data in a way to create thick description. And I may customize photo voice. Maybe there's a certain way I'm going to be gathering photography or photos. Maybe there's a certain way we're going to conduct interviews. Maybe our interview is going to be actually through, people writing poetry rather than doing a classic call and response. There's a lot of customizable components for this, but we do that in order to fit the context in which we're trying to describe to someone else. So that can be helpful too because qualitative research may not always fit the kind of models we have for the IRB. As I mentioned earlier, many IRBs are still based off biomedical and behavioral models where we view research participants as subjects rather than collaborators. And community engaged research, they're collaborating. And a lot of qualitative research will view this as a form of collaborating, especially if someone uses, let's say, narrative methods where there is a co-authoring component of gathering the data. It can also be helpful too is be aware of how IRBs and institutions view knowledge production. Do they view knowledge more from a quantitative lens? Is qualitative lens a common approach for it, whatever it may be, and really reflect of who can and cannot engage in this process. Are we open for students in being involved in research? Are we not going to support that type of components? What does it look like when we're going to have community members who want to be active collaborators? And then, addition to reflecting upon how does the IRB determine research expertise and competency? And that's a really strong question to reflect upon because typically we review research expertise based off education, training, and experience. Yet, if we're going to have community members who are going to engage in this process, how are we going to determine their competency levels? So, in addition, what I've heard sometimes as well, that uh, human subjects should not be able to engage in research design, data collection, etc., because of the potential bias of the research. That increases the potential bias. For sure. Okay, that is an important uh, component. I'm not going to disagree with that. However, it's important to understand that is a mindset very much from a quantitative perspective. In addition to, in our role of the IRB, I think the more important response to that question is let's reframe it of rather than looking at potential bias of the research itself, does this potential bias impact our research participants? Just reframing it as well may be helpful and foster a further discussion. I do want to acknowledge, though, that there are some tricky areas. That doesn't mean this type of research should not be approved by the IRB or that we should remove these type of tricky areas, but rather how do we work with them? The first component is community engaged research slash participatory research tends to work with communities who may be classified as vulnerable populations, whether that's federal definition of vulnerable populations, such as women, children, prisoners, or maybe we have ethical communities that we have identified specifically for our IRB, such as veterans, students, um, you name it. So we need to be aware that this type of research tends to engage in populations that are seen as vulnerable. So then how do we best protect these participants, especially if they want to collaborate in the research element? In addition, we're gathered it's most likely, especially if it's a qualitative component, is to collect personal information that tends to be on a sensitive topic. Because the nature of this research is to promote some sort of action or change that is meaningful to the community, most likely then we're going to have information related to sensitive topics. So again, how do we explore that and best protect our participants? In addition, as well, this research is tend to be done in the field. So outside of a laboratory setting, in the quote unquote real world. And in addition, with that, we're probably going to be doing it with community members. And this is going to increase the complexity in obtaining informed consent. So, for example, let's say part of the field research is attending a town hall meeting or engaging in a local coffee shop. So, there may be community members who are walking in and out of a setting or who may be sharing information. And then how do we obtain their consent? What can be really helpful is looking at other forms of social science, such as anthropology, which again has done a lot of field work in this field, or sociology. And commonly, what can be helpful in when a researcher is engaging in data collection within a public or quote unquote public or community setting, that a common best practice is for someone to identify themselves as a researcher. So let's say they're at a town hall meeting, they may be uh, collecting notes or data analysis of what that meeting was like, and then they can still identify themselves and then really have a conversation or have the PI describe, okay, what's the situation going to be like when you're in a more community engaged component? What is the data you're collection? How are you going to inform someone? Even if people have not given their informed consent, is there a way to still de-identify public conversations that are occurring, etc.? There's a whole array of conversation that can be happening with this. And a lot of researchers who are trained in fieldwork already have a strong knowledge of how they're going to best work in that situation. So really encourage the IRB to have dialogue with the researchers about this process. And another hallmark or tricky area, as I mentioned before, community members who may want to engage in research may not have prior experience or lack the training in research. So how do we address that? Um, Likewise, data management gets complex, unfortunately. If we have uh, a lot of individuals who are collecting data in various components, there may be a lot of data collection methods, there may be various site locations, and we have various personnel collecting that information, just increases the complexity of data management. So how do we best have this conversation of developing data management practices that best protect our participants? And finally, as I mentioned many times already, this type of research design tends to be fluid and modified based on the community feedback that the researchers are receiving. So, what's a helpful lens for IRB members to have when they're reviewing this type of research is the ethical responsibility and protection is just not to the participants in the research, but the community as a whole. And with that, we want to explore what the researchers, the participants, and then community partners' concerns and wants are for protection in terms of safety and well-being before, during, and after the research takes place. This may be a new feature for many IRPs. because many times we make decisions about human subject protection within an IRB meeting or an IRB review component. We may not always actually have community members, researchers, and participants in an active discussion of what their concerns are and needs for protection related from an IRB proposal. So this could be an opportunity for an IRB to foster dialogue with community and potential participants and the researchers about what they are looking for in terms of safety and how the IRB can best support or provide education on what the safety requirements may be or are required. And then finally, it's very important for IRB members, I think, to have basics training on qualitative methods such as CENR. So, as I mentioned, I think this type of research is going to unfortunately require um, active engagement from an IRB perspective. And it can be, I say that as a suggestion, it's going to make the the work in the beginning is going to save you time in the end. And so it can be helpful when this type of research is going to come down the pipeline for IRBs to be ready for it. And one way we can be ready for it is by establishing working relationships with PI and community members who do this type of research and having outreach and encouragement for PIs and community members to connect with the IRB prior to protocol submission. By having communication prior to submission, we can give some guidance and focus on questions about the role the community members will play in the research, and that'll help us determine, if people need to be on the protocol, the training requirements, what other agreements may be needed, what other, regulatory requirements may be something to consider. So essentially, we can be proactive in our pre-submission work where we can talk to community members and PIs and other researchers affiliated with this type of project. And that helps us as well as we're having these dialogues to prepare the IRB for review. So, as I mentioned too, things to reflect about in this pre-work component when a community engaged research project is going to be up for protocol submission, we really want to know, are IRB policies going to be accessible to community members? They really reflect on, can someone unfamiliar with regulations and research in general make sense of our IRB policies? That is a question that we may not have an easy answer to. Our policies may not be able to be modified, and I understand that. Legal counsel got involved, maybe your faculty senate got involved, maybe specifically for specific regulations, we need specific language. So that's okay, like I get that. So if our policies can't be updated to be more accessible, then I think we take the onus on the IRB. We need to take an active role then to find a way to interpret and communicate those policies to community members that is accessible. No different than the thing that we require our PIs to do for the informed consent process. I think we almost need to practice what we preach sometimes and do the same due diligence about communicating our own policies in an understandable manner to community members. So, how can the IRB, in addition with that, the IRB will need to learn more, I think, about communities' research needs. So, what does that look like? And I understand too, like, I know, like, it can be difficult. IRBs, we may have limited resources. But again, is there some flexibility in how we best can learn about those community needs? Relatedly, we commonly hear the importance of having community members on the IRB. And it can be helpful to reflect upon too, what are the incentives for someone to be on the IRB, especially in research universities or universities with researchers, faculty, etc. Uh, Many times those employed by an institution will get some sort of incentive to be an IRB member. So maybe a faculty member is interested in being on the IRB because this counts for service for their own tenure and promotion requirements. Um, though that type of incentive is not relevant for a community member. So then therefore, what other incentives are there available for those community members? So when we're looking at an IRB protocol for this type of community engaged research, it's helpful to have detailed information on the community's role in planning, conducting, or disseminating results of the research. It's helpful to understand the role community members play in the research and can provide guidance on if community members need to be added to the protocol, as well as the various level of training required. We also can be helpful to be aware of IRB process on how key personnel and training requirements um, are accessed to those members. Again, do they need to log into CITI? Do they need to log in, submit a protocol online? What are those requirements look like? So the thing though to remember with training requirements is with community engaged research, there's a strong chance we're going to have members of the research team who are not affiliated with the university research institution, and this can create a common barrier to training requirements, such as using CITI. We also, in addition to that, because again, I will give credit, I know there are some institutions who found a way to work through that element. However, in still using a platform like CITI, be aware though that much of the training out there for related to research protections has been created by and for researchers. Therefore, it may be appropriate to have alternative training options for community members. One thing I'd like to talk about too is the University of Illinois Chicago specifically has a free CI certification training that a lot of institutions are starting to use more. In addition, you may also want to create a more homemade or institution-made training specifically relevant to the type of research that's occurring. The other suggestion I want to give too is we may need to change our how we view an IRB approval. Again, commonly, an IRB protocol, we want it to be from soup to nuts, from start to finish. Um, some other recommendations because of the nature of this type of research, I think sometimes it may be appropriate to use a different method. One could be a stage approval process. Or what I mean by this is if we know this type of research is going to have multiple phase projects, rather than detailing the entire research process, we could have a protocol that is submitted specifically on a specific stage. And then, either through future amendments or maybe an additional protocol, we can add those other stages when ready. This allows flexibility to be integrated into the approval process. Another component, and this may be more appropriate for field work that is more complex, and this is inspired by IACUC field studies, that an umbrella approach is when, and again, this I see this a lot in IACUC field studies, a researcher is going to submit a protocol where they have various scenarios and options of how they're going to conduct the research based on the environment or based on what's being presented. So, for example, they could have, if we get feedback from community members about this, we're going to go in this direction. If feedback is this, we'll go in that direction. So, an umbrella approach is we have various options laid out and detailed, describing when those options will and will not be utilized, and we can approve those components. And then again, having communication, or maybe it's going to be an annual review of the community members and the researchers describing what options were selected through that process. With informed consent, can be tricky with type of field work we're talking about, so it may not always be appropriate or feasible to get written consent. Again, as IRB members, we are aware of this. So it can be helpful, I think, to have conversations with the PI and the community members of what type of consent is going to be best suited for this type of research. And finally, or not finally, but I also want you to consider too, the dissemination process. So this is unique. I think this type of research is really focusing on how could the community be impacted by the research findings? What are the potential impact on community members being identified? And then would formal slash written agreements on dissemination between community members and university affiliated researchers be appropriate? So here's some checklists I think that can be helpful when reviewing this type of protocols. The first one to start off with, is this type of research methods appropriate to the research question? So there should be some congruence between what we hope to discover and the method we're utilizing. Also assess what the level of involvement of community members are and has the appropriate permissions been obtained. Is appropriate measures and considerations in play to protect research participants and community members? What type of research training and expertise is appropriate for this research? And what are some possible barriers that may prevent community participation? And how can those barriers be addressed? So, things to take away from, what are some alternative pathways for training requirements? So, is city appropriate or CITI? Do we want to use the certification from University of Illinois Chicago, or maybe we develop our own training within our institution? Encourage the involvement of community partners in any communication pre and post IRB protocol submission. Maybe we're going to do a different stage of protocol approach or approval process. And then finally, how would non-affiliated members access important training documents? There's my references, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. And we're gonna